The mountains do not care for your experience. They do not care for your high-end gear or the GPS units strapped to your chest. In the heart of the crazy mountains, the wind has a way of stripping the ego from a man before it takes his life. It is a jagged, unforgiving stretch of Montana wilderness where the granite peaks look less like natural formations and more like broken teeth rising from the earth. Up there, the air is thin, and the logic of the modern world begins to fray at the edges, leaving you alone with something that was here long before we learned to walk upright. The silence in these high-altitude corridors is not a peaceful thing. It is heavy, like the weight of a deep ocean pressing against your eardrums. Most people think of the woods as a noisy place, filled with the rustle of dry leaves and the chatter of squirrels. But not here. In the missing 411 cases that haunt this specific range, the survivors and the witnesses speak of a sudden, terrifying vacuum of sound. One moment, the world is alive. The next, it is as if the universe has held its breath, waiting for something unpleasant to happen. He was a man who knew these ridges like the back of his own hand. A hunter who had spent decades navigating the steep draws and the treacherous scree slopes. He carried a heavy pack, loaded with enough supplies to last a week, and a rifle that had never failed him in the field. This was not a novice wandering off the trail to take a photograph of a wildflower. This was a seasoned professional, entering a landscape he respected. Yet, the mountain has a way of changing the rules of the game without warning. The sun was a pale, sickly disk hanging over the horizon as he crested the first major ridge. The light was wrong, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to move independently of the trees. He checked his watch, noting it was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But the environment felt like the deep, cold hours of twilight. A strange metallic tang began to coat his tongue, a taste like a copper penny, or the air right before a massive lightning strike. There was no thunder, only a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the marrow of his bones. He should have turned back when the birds stopped singing. But the human mind is a stubborn thing that seeks to rationalize the irrational. He told himself it was just the altitude, a simple case of mild hypoxia playing tricks on his inner ear and his sense of balance. But as he looked down at his compass, the needle didn't point north. It spun in slow, lazy circles, as if the very magnetism of the earth had been pulled out of alignment. He was standing in a pocket of reality that was no longer following the standard map. Every step forward felt like wading through thick, invisible syrup that resisted his movement. The air grew dense and smelled of ozone and ancient, wet stone. He began to feel a sensation of being watched, not by a predator in the brush, but by the peaks themselves. It was as if the mountains were sentient, monolithic observers tracking his every heartbeat with a cold, geological patience. He stopped to catch his breath, and realized that he couldn't hear the sound of his own respiration. The first piece of gear he discarded was his heavy hunting jacket, a high-quality piece of clothing designed to keep a man warm in sub-zero temperatures. It was found later by search teams, neatly folded on top of a flat boulder as if it had been placed there for a store display. There was no signs of a struggle, no blood, no torn fabric, just a discarded layer left behind in a place where the temperature was dropping into the low 30s. It made no sense for a rational man to strip in the freezing wind. Unless the heat he felt wasn't coming from the sun, he continued upward, moving away from the safety of his camp and toward the jagged summits that were now shrouded in a thick, unnatural mist. His footprints in the light dusting of snow told a story of a man moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. A straight line that ignored the natural contours of the trail. He was climbing over fallen timber and pushing through dense thickets of mountain mahogany that should have been avoided. It was a panicked flight. Or perhaps a forced march. By the time the sun fully disappeared, he had reached a plateau that was miles away from his intended route. A distance that should have taken 2 days to cover on foot. He was moving at a speed that defied human physical limits, especially for a man carrying 40 pounds of equipment. But the equipment was disappearing, piece by piece. His gloves were found 3 miles back, snagged on a branch at eye level. His emergency radio was discovered at the bottom of a steep ravine, its casing shattered as if it had been dropped from a great height. The search and rescue teams arrived 48 hours later, their helicopters buzzing like angry hornets against the vast, grey face of the mountain. They found the silence he had encountered, a stifling quiet that even the roar of the engines couldn't fully pierce. The canine units, highly trained bloodhounds with hundreds of successful finds, were useless here. They reached a specific line of white quartz rocks and simply sat down. Refusing to go a single inch further, they whimpered and tucked their tails, their eyes fixed on the empty air in front of them. It is a common theme in these missing 411 disappearances, the way the dogs react to the unseen. They sense a predator that doesn't leave a scent, a presence that vibrates at a frequency our human ears are too dull to register. The handlers reported a feeling of intense nausea and vertigo as they stood near that quartz line. A physical rejection by the land itself. It was as if they were standing at the edge of a door that had been slammed shut and locked from the other side. Days turned into a week, and the weather in the crazies turned vicious. A wall of snow and ice that buried any hope of finding a living man. The volunteers retreated, leaving the mountain to its secrets. But the mystery only deepened when the snow began to melt the following spring. A pair of boots was found on a high ledge, over 2,000 feet above the tree line. They were unlaced and placed side by side, pointing toward the rising sun. There were no socks inside them, and no footprints leading away from the ledge. The human body is not meant to survive at those heights without protection. Yet there he was, or at least, there his remnants were. When they finally found him, he was miles away from the boots, in a location that required technical climbing gear to access. He was lying in a small cave-like depression in the rock, his body positioned in a way that suggested he had simply laid down and waited for the end. But the autopsy would later reveal something that chilled the investigators to their core. There were no broken bones, no signs of starvation, and no evidence of animal scavenging, which was nearly impossible in a wilderness filled with grizzly bears and mountain lions. It was as if the animals themselves knew to stay away from the remains, as if he had become something toxic or untouchable. His stomach was empty, but his body showed signs of extreme cellular stress, the kind usually seen in victims of high-intensity radiation or massive electrical discharge. He hadn't just died. He had been processed. The boots being removed is a recurring detail in these cases, a chilling signature that points to something beyond simple hypothermia. Skeptics will tell you that paradoxical undressing is a common symptom of freezing to death, where the victim feels a false sensation of heat and strips off their clothes. But that doesn't explain the neatness. It doesn't explain why a man would carefully unlace his boots and set them aside before wandering into the abyss. It feels less like a biological malfunction and more like a ritual. Some researchers suggest that certain mountainous areas act as natural resonators for infrasound, low-frequency waves generated by the wind hitting the rock faces at specific angles. These frequencies can induce feelings of dread, hallucinations, and a total loss of spatial awareness. A literal mountain madness. If a person were to walk into a concentrated pocket of this sound, their mind would shatter in minutes. They would see things that aren't there and feel a desperate need to escape their own skin. But infrasound doesn't explain the distances traveled or the way the gear is found in impossible locations. There is a sense of a predatory intelligence at work, something that plays with its prey before discarding it in a place where it will eventually be found. It is a grim game of hide and seek, where the seeker is an entity that exists just outside our field of vision. A shadow that moves through the granite as easily as we move through the air. This is the heart of the missing 411 enigma. We like to think of the wilderness as a place we can conquer with technology and grit. But these cases prove that we are only guests in these high places. And sometimes, the host is not friendly. The hiker in the crazy mountains was a man of the earth. A man who understood the risks of his hobby, but he didn't account for the silence. And he didn't account for the vibration in the rock that told him he was no longer at the top of the food chain. The search for answers continues. But the mountains are experts at keeping their mouths shut. Every year, more people vanish into the thin air of the national parks, leaving behind nothing but a trail of folded clothes and unanswered questions. We map the terrain and we name the peaks, but we never truly know what lives in the shadows of the draws. We are just passers-by in a landscape that has a very long memory and a very dark appetite. The case of the crazy mountains is not an isolated incident. but part of a terrifying pattern that spans the globe. There are places on this map where the fabric of our reality seems to be worn thin, and the things on the other side are looking through. When you step off the trail and into the deep timber, you are taking a gamble with your very existence. And the house always has the advantage. You might be the hunter one moment, and the missing person the next. Consider the strange disappearance of Danny Filippidis, a firefighter who went missing during a ski trip in Lake Placid, New York, only to turn up 6 days later in Sacramento, California. He was still wearing his ski gear and had no memory of how he had crossed the entire continent. A journey that would be impossible to make unnoticed and without a vehicle. His case, like so many others, suggests a rift in the way we understand time and space in the wild. The mountains are calling, as the old saying goes, but perhaps we should be more careful about how we answer. For some, the call is a siren song that leads into a silence from which no one returns. The hiker in Montana, the firefighter in New York. They are all just entries in a ledger that we are still trying to decipher. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we actually know about the world beyond the pavement. As the sun sets over the crazy mountains, the shadows stretch out to claim the valleys once again, and the low hum begins to vibrate in the stones. If you find yourself in those high places, and the birds go quiet, and the air begins to taste of copper, do not stop to investigate. Do not trust your compass, and do not trust your eyes. Turn around and run for the lowlands before the mountain decides that you are exactly what it has been looking for. The missing 411 cases are more than just statistics. They are a reminder of the vast, terrifying unknown that still exists in our backyard. We are not as safe as we think we are, and the earth is not as well mapped as we believe. There are still holes in the world, and people are still falling through them, leaving us to wonder what happens to a man when the silence finally catches up with him. Stay on the trail, and keep your boots laced tight. The granite peaks stand silent, watching the next generation of hikers enter their domain with their brightly colored packs and their false sense of security. The mountains have all the time in the world to wait for the next mistake, the next moment of vulnerability, and when that moment comes, the silence will fall again, and another name will be added to the list of those who simply walked away into the gray mist. The mountains remember, but they never tell.